about classic hibernation, if you like, your long-eared, your myotis. You know, they're underground, they're in with us, they're in mines, they're in tunnels. We haven't got caves in Northumberland, but we're finding them generally in these nice, dark, damp underground sites. It's not where the pips are. So it is like, where do the pips go? I think their sites, pipistrelle sites especially, are really under-recorded. I'm sure a lot of them are probably staying in their summer roosts that we're unaware of, and obviously can't really prove unless they're found as part of destructive mitigation, which is not great because then they've been disturbed. But I think for pips, we're just looking in the wrong places. And once we sort of got the idea of that, when we started looking in what I think are the right places, we were actually finding them. So this is the one that Karen's just mentioned, Seton Delaval Hall. It's a National Trust property. It's open to the public. It's the central hall is where the bats are. It was burnt out just over 200 years ago and then stood empty for about 60 years. And I think to me, that's the key of why it's become so important. It had no windows and no roof. So you can see from the state of the stonework, I'm hoping you can see my mouse moving around. You know, it's battered, it's bashed, it's been weathered. So it means instead of the stones being perfect and meeting, they're actually they've been weathered, they're worn away, and the gaps don't come together clean anymore. So these pictures here, all of these have got winter roosts in them. They're all known hibernation sites. And yes, this was, when we found this was the largest known pipistrelle hibernation site. I had one that had around 50 bats, which at the time I didn't know was the biggest. When I turned this up with, I think it was 62 to start with, I got in touch with the Bat Conservation Trust, and Philip was like, you know, that's the biggest in the country. And it was like, wow. My highest count now has been 70, but I know I'm not finding them all. This has only got a ground floor and one mezzanine layer, so I can't see into all the cracks and crevices. So all my counts will be, I've put maximum count, really it's a minimum count. There will be bats I'm not finding. But what also I think is really interesting is there's actually within just this building, there's 82 separate locations that I found them in. So they're mobile, they move from visit to visit. So we have core sites, if you like, that they're in a lot of the time. And generally pips are solitary, even over winter, or you might get 2 or 3 in a crevice. You don't get a lot, although we've got one site that's the exception to the rule. So again, Seton Delaval Hall's the biggest one. I monitor 4 in Northumberland, where the minimum counts have all been 42 and above, which currently makes them the 4 biggest in the country, which is just daft. They're not all going to be in Northumberland. You know, if nothing else tonight, I want to infuse you to like get out there and actually find them, because you think how many pipistrelles we've got in summer. I can probably account for 500 or 600. That's just nothing. You know, they're there and we're not finding them. But all the sites we're looking in, they're above ground, they're light, they're not obviously humid. Yes, they do have high humidity, but not in the way that like a lead mine does. So I think really you need to be looking at castles, churches, large hole, like Seton Delaval Hall. It's like a stately home that's like no longer furnished. It now has windows and a roof, but it's just derelict's unfair, but it's exposed stonework and exposed wood. They are challenging sites. And when I I do try and get incriminating photos of some of my volunteers. So this guy here, bless him, he's actually the church warden. And in this site, this is the exception to my rule. We can have up to 50 pipistrelles in this little gap here between a rafter and the stone wall of the vestry. So that's the only site where we get a lot roosting together. And this site here, these little darlings are over 16 metres up between the roof timbers and the wall. And over time, we've adapted our methods. And here's Neil laying down on the job, but he's actually got an amazing long lens camera. And now we've actually started taking photographs, because if Neil can get a good photograph, we can then spend time looking at the image rather than keep putting lights onto the bats. But they are challenging sites. They're usually cold as well. So where do you find them? I think if the site has woodwork left, and not all of mine do, that's where they're going to be. They seem to have a preference for between stone and wood. So these are 2 different castle sites, and these are all known hibernation sites within these areas. Of course, there is always one, but they are just sitting up between where woods either running parallel to stone or where your rafters are actually going in and they're sitting in the sockets. And again, as you can see, these are quite challenging sites to see into. They're not easy. Sometimes we're standing on pews or standing on benches. We're using torches, binoculars. Then, they're not easy to see, which is why I think they've been overlooked for so long. Because if you just walked through as a visitor, you wouldn't have a clue there was a bat there, let alone that it was nationally significant. And again, when they're between the stone and wood, generally, I think they tend to have their backs to the wood. And again, I don't know if there's any reason for that, but it does seem to be a feature. And I will just point this little guy out while we're here. Just have a look at the size of the forearm and the paleness. So we'll come back to that. So again, if they haven't got wood, they're using stone. So this image here is actually from Seton Delaval Hall. This is on the ground floor. They actually close the balcony in winter because of the hibernating bats. There's actually more of them in this wall than there are on the balcony, but that's how it is. So they are just, again, just using cracks and crevices. I mean, this one's about 50 centimetres up from the floor. And also this corridor is where the majority of the visitors walk through. It is quite amazing. You just wouldn't know they're there. And they're obviously not bothered about height. And these holes are used like year on year. So they're obviously well known. And this is another one of our sites, the Manor House. You see Ian here's pointing to a roost, and we were there on Friday, and we actually found a bat in this little gap here, which was a new one to us. So we do keep records of where they all are because I think it's really useful. But when you're finding them between stone, sometimes we're finding them in sort of like, if you like, rough masonry, where it almost doesn't look like the gap's big enough for the bat to have gone in. And you can just see, like an elbow or a little bit of fur. So, I mean, this one's higher up and it's sitting looking at us. And again, you do get a few shoved in together, but that's less common. So because these sites are so important, they're all registered for the National Bat Monitoring Programme through the Bat Conservation Trust. And because I'm nosy, I tend to count them October to March, because what's really nice is you can see how the bats move in and then how they start to move away in March as well. So my church was my first site. I'm actually on my fourth vicar there, and I've been counting it since 2009, but we suddenly got an influx of pipistrelles in 2013. The Basel site was the next one to be, no, that was the last one to be found. So between 2013, Seton Delaval was found in 2017. So we've got sort of 3 years data for one site, but obviously COVID got in the way as well. So we haven't got full count data. But this just gives you an idea of how the bats use the site. So October, we get a few move in, November, but then you can see by December, they start to peak a little bit, and then January, February are always the highest counts, and they drop in March, but not significantly. But generally, when you go back in April, they've all gone. But it does just fit this really nice bell curve of, how they move in and how they move out again. But by counting over several months, we just get that spread of data. So as I mentioned earlier, these are not easy sites, but it is just that systematic search. And something I really have to be careful of is the way my mind works. If I've seen a bat in a roost, I remember that. I probably can't find my way to the building, but when I'm in it, I can find the bats. And I have to really resist the urge of just checking where you know where they were before. So it is that systematically looking in crevices, looking between wood and stone. And again, once you start to get a feel for where they are, you'll think, oh, in that building, they were tucked into an angle like this. So it's just getting that learned information and just starting to build a picture of where you might find them. This is our Priory site, and as you can see, this is not an easy site. An absolutely amazing building. So we started off just with some rapidly torching binoculars, and now we have Neil, our resident paparazzi, who's just absolutely fantastic. He's even now customised a tripod with a wooden triangle in it so you can get the camera at the perfect angle. Absolutely brilliant. But again, all this is just being done by the group of us just going out regularly and sort of thinking, right, this is what we can do. How can we improve it and move on? And our counts are improving, but I think that is because we're getting to know the buildings better, but also where we're looking, we're becoming more experienced as where we might find them. So again, all of these show roost locations. I mean, it would only be a pip, wouldn't it, behind a nice bit of plywood saying that it's got to wear a safety harness. This is just a piece of wood just hanging against a wall in a church tower. This is one of our little masonry holes. And this one, it's a manor house. From this level, you can't actually see the bat in this lintel, but when you're on the next level up, which is a small wooden gantry, and you look across, you can see them. So they're very, very sneaky. But it is just that getting a feel and just looking everywhere you think they might get in. And again, the guys that come out with me regularly, I mean, they do tease me, but yeah, I have my photo guides. So this is one of my castle sites. I mean, this actually needs updating after the first survey for this winter. We've got a couple more holes in this wall. And again, this one's Seaton Delaval Hall, which is the biggest known site at the moment. But what this does mean is, yes, we've got a record of where they are. So if the buildings want to do any work, they've actually got this data up front. And it's cumulative. We built it up over a number of years. So it'd be much more in depth than if somebody went in and just surveyed it for one winter, because we've got years worth of variation. But also it means that once you found a roost, because we've got a record of where it was, you know that's checked like every time you go back. So I think that is why sometimes our counts are increasing, because we're going again and we're going, oh, right, yeah, we looked in there before. Oh, there's one in there before. But again, it's just really that triggering of, oh, yeah, these are the sort of places I need to look. And I mean, this is Seaton Delaval Hall. This is 3 stories up. I mean, that's just cheeky, but you can just see one tucked in there with a powerful torch. So they do tuck themselves away. So something else that I've become interested in, I don't know if anyone's really come across this. Frost swarming is something that Eric Corsten first described in the Netherlands back in 2016. He was actually, and again, at the time, he didn't really know what it was. He was finding that when the temperature was dropping to below zero, they were getting some buildings. With him, it was mainly high-rise flats and car parks and bizarre things that we wouldn't look at, which is terrifying, where you'd actually got common pipistrelles flying actively in really low temperatures and sort of 40, 50 bats at a time. It was just phenomenal. He wrote it up in Bat Conservation Trust Bat News, and you're like, ooh, that's really interesting. And then a little bit later, Eric Corsten worked with Eric Janssen, who does stuff in Germany, and they've actually put together some methodology for actually trying to find frost swarming. And their understanding is that early in the winter, pipistrelles especially will go to known hibernation sites that probably aren't optimum. And then when the temperature drops sharply, they'll move into these sort of optimal hibernation sites. And that's what this swarming behavior is they're flying around outside before they're actually going into like their final winter roost. Now, again, it's all theory, but you've probably worked out by now, I'm just nosy. So I was like, so are my bats doing this? So again, I use audio moths. They're cheap, they're cheerful. I've found they're really reliable. I know that's not what everybody says, but I've been putting them out in my buildings. I've got some out in 2 of my sites again this winter, which will be the 3rd winter in a row. But we were actually looking at recording bat flight activity, and Janssen's paper was saying it's the most activity is between the 2nd and 3rd hours after sunset, which is great. So instead of having to record all night now, I can just record like 2 hours a night, and I'm doing this from October. Well, we did go till March, but I think realistically we can probably end it in January, because by then they're not going to be moving in. But again, this is all just really novel stuff. It's just fantastic. So the first year I had 5 sites. 3 were big hibernation sites that I had permission for. I didn't get permission for the 4th. And I thought, well, I've got more audio moths. So I found 2 other sites where we had lower numbers of bats. So these are the 5 sites that I was looking at for frost swarming. And again, this just gives you the spread of data over the months. And you can see we've got the 3 big sites. We've got Seaton Delaval, Warkworth Castle and Mitford Church. And then we've got Brinkburn Priory and Brinkburn Manor House. And I think it's interesting that the Priory and the Manor House, the highest count was 17 for the Manor House, and I think 17 for the Priory and 11 for the Manor House. So in the scheme of things, you're not talking a lot of bats, which is interesting. But again, that's what we put the acoustic data in for. So this is the data from 22, 23. I have data from 23, 24, but it's to my shame, it's not all fully analysed yet. Because I'd love to know if this happens more than one year or if this was just a one-off. But it's just amazing. You can see dead of winter and you're getting these peaks in activity. And what is fascinating is you're getting these peaks, similar peaks across, especially here, across all the sites, except to be fair for the Manor House, which actually very little happened. But I think one of the reasons for that is the other 4 buildings where the detectors were in big spaces. whereas the manor house is divided into many rooms. It could just be that I put the detectors in the wrong room. And this is happening, but not where I was looking. Again, I don't have data for that, but I think that's just something else to throw into the what's really going on here. So all the work on the continent only talks about common pipistrelles undertaking frost swarming, which I think is really interesting because what I didn't say earlier is when I record my pipistrelles in winter, some you can see well enough to say they're either soprano or common pip. And I know that can be really hard. So a lot of them do get recorded just as pipistrelle. And certainly for analysis in terms of counts, I just call them all pipistrelles because I'm not sure enough of all the identifications. But obviously with the acoustic data, we can split it out. And interestingly, soprano pips make up about a quarter of the acoustic data. So that's different to mainland Europe for a start, which again, it's like, we're just finding out things all the time. I can't explain it yet, but it is interesting. But again, when you're looking at the species, you're getting the same peaks of activity. Definitely a sort of towards the end of January, there was definitely something going on, which is just brilliant. But again, you're getting these peaks across different sites by species as well. So frost swarming. So the theory that Eric Janssen and Eric Corson have put across is that when the temperature drops early in the winter, so sort of now onwards really, to below freezing for the first time or stays below freezing, you get a spike in bat activity because the pipistrelles are moving to these known sites. So this is Seaton Delaval Hall. I mean, one night we had 280 odd calls and it's like, just what are they doing? It's just amazing. But when you look at the temperature data, which is in blue, and the number of pipistrelle calls based on the 2 hours a night of audio moths, you can see we've got a big temperature drop here, and then, oh, there's a spike in activity. And then there's a bit of bat activity, but not a lot. And then the temperature drops, and then look at the response. This is just absolutely amazing. So this does statistically fit and suggests that actually, certainly at Seaton Delaval Hall, these bats are frost swarming, which again is a first for the UK. It isn't that it's not happening because it must be, it's just that it's not been found yet. So again, this is something else to go out looking for. So Seaton Delaval, I was expecting something to happen because we know we have a lot of bats. But Brinkburn Priory, again, we've got a lot of bat calls. I mean, our highest was, 300, 362, I think it was one evening. And again, it's towards the end of January, which is later than we probably thought. And just as a reminder, Seaton Delaval is the yellow one. We get a lot of bats. These are our counts for the Priory. They're really relatively low. And yet acoustically, we're getting an equivalent amount of activity as at Seaton Delaval Hall. So I think just by leaving detectors there, it's like we're picking something up. But again, you can see the pattern, drop in temperature, stays drop, a little bit delayed there. Again, drop. This is the same drop as at Seaton Delaval. You've got a spike in activity. So it does seem to be following a very similar pattern, but not maybe quite as pronounced as for Seaton Delaval. But again, it's just something to think about. So the Priory, we've got a lot more flight activity than my visual counts would suggest. So it's either these bats are far more active, or I think more realistically, despite our best efforts, we're still actually missing a lot of bats. And a different paper by Eric Janssen helpfully states that in their opinion, you find between 22 and 90% of bats in a hibernacula. That's just not helpful. How he's come to that conclusion, I'm not entirely sure anyway, but it just doesn't even give you an idea that you're finding half or you're finding 20%. So we are missing a lot of bats. But I think where this could be useful is if you can get access to a building, you could maybe actually use acoustic data to see if it is, even just if it is being used as a hibernacula and if it is tied in with extra activity around temperature drops. But as I say, I've still got some analysis to be done and I've got detectors out. So now last year and this year, I've only had detectors at the two sites where I've had the main activity, just to try and see if we can actually prove that frost swarming is happening and that wasn't just a freak in the first year. It'd be brilliant to prove it. But also, while I've been doing this, Nathesius pipistrelle, we have them in Northumberland. We have had a maternity colony, but that has since moved on. And interestingly, we had a female bat ringed at Druridge Bay, which is on the northeast coast. that the next summer turned up in Poland during the breeding season. So there's no wonder we couldn't find the roost if certain individuals are moving from Northumberland to Poland. But again, I'm interested in Nethusius pipistrelle because I think they're fascinating. But I found this bat, and yes, it's a really bad photo, but if you have a look, it just looks somehow different. This was March 2018. At this point, Nethusius pipistrelle don't hibernate in the UK, or that's what we understood. But there was just something about it. It's got a little bit of a pale belly. It looks a little bit chunky, but that was it. It was one off, Seton Delaval Hall. You know, when you just think, okay, I'm wrong. But luckily I kept a photograph of it. Then nothing until November 22. This is my castle site, tucked away in there. Could not get a good photo, but with binoculars, you could definitely see the pale underside. February 23, so the same winter, I had one in this crevice here, which is Seton Delaval Hall, and this little guy turned up. This is Mitford Church. Now, something I've just come to realise literally in the last week or so, soprano, you see, I'm convinced these are Nethusius pipistrelle. They look a bit different, but look at the size of the forearm. It's thick, it's really bulky. But something else I've just noticed is they seem to hold them slightly more angular than pipistrelles. And again, I can't put my finger on it. I don't know if it's diagnostic, but you know when you just suddenly look at enough photos and you think, I can see a pattern. So if I just flick back to this one, again, that shape's there. You don't get that on the others. So I think that with hindsight, I think that was my first Nethusius, even though I didn't really call it at the time. So again, I've got all these detectors out. I'm not picking them up much. Two sites, Warkworth Castle and Mitford Church. We've actually picked up good quality Nethusius pip calls, but only 3 audiomoth files. So it's enough to back me up that they are there, but not as much as you would expect. And again, the next winter, they're definitely here. We've actually now seen them in 5 sites. And again, it's this angle, pale underneath, but they just hold themselves differently. One of my colleagues, Mandy, actually said they look like they're poised, like they're ready to spring into action. And I can see exactly what she means. So this is now just gratuitous photos of bats in holes. But here you can see we've got a soprano pip. And you see how straight it's holding its forearm. And it just doesn't have the bulk of the bat above it, which again, this is Aidan Castle. This is another site that it's closed over the winter. I don't always have access to, but we managed to get in November last year. And we found this little guy. We've even found up to 3 Nethusius pips in sites. And I think this was such a nice little bat. It was on eye level. It was at the front of its crevice. I mean, that is 100% a Nethusius. Look at its face. But again, you've got that shape and you've got that paleness. So that's all I want to say for now. Just thank you to everybody. This project wouldn't have happened without a lot of help from a lot of people. And especially the sites where I've had audiomoths out. Some of these sites are closed for winter, so we actually meet people and they let us in and they wait for us to change things. Absolutely amazing. A lot of support from a lot of people. Martin at Sonobat, I'm sure he was getting to the point where he was like, you've broken it again? He was just amazing. And for more information, that's the 2 papers that I've referred to. And I think certainly looking at the Janssen paper, because it's actually got a methodology for going out and finding pips in winter. And there is a write-up of this in British Island Bats, Volume 4. So again, if anybody wants something slightly more concrete than me just warbling on about it, have a look. That's it from me. So thank you.